Hi, good afternoon. It is Dan Kurz, DK Analytics. Appreciate you tuning in. It is Wednesday, June 4th, 2020. The topic of this video is a multi-year, multi-pronged coup effort. Before I get into it, some brief valuation metrics. The US DXY index stood at 96.91. The Fed's balance sheet stood at 7.1 trillion. These are, by the way, intraday rates from today, or metrics, valuations. The balance sheet of the Fed is once again nearly double what it was less than a year ago. The US 10-year yielded 0.8%. The yield is rising and a bond is under some pressure and sympathy with the dollar. The S&P 500 recently stood at 31.16, oil at $36.51 per blue barrel, gold at $1,718 per troy ounce, and silver at $18.01 per troy ounce. Some brief observations in addition to what I just said. The buck remains under pressure, and the S&P is only 7% below its all-time high. Yet the U.S. economy continues to crater as political uncertainty waxes. Let me get into the coup effort. The Democrats have tried to get rid of Trump, essentially even before he was elected. And so did a lot of rhinos, by the way. And in case he was elected, they took out, the Democrats, a mobster-like insurance policy. This policy was criminal and included weaponizing, that is, politicizing, bureaucracies such as the CIA, the FBI, the FISA court, and even the Department of Justice to act lawlessly against a U.S. citizen, a presidential candidate, a sitting president, and members of his election team and cabinet, starting from the National Security Advisor, the former National Security Advisor Flynn, on down. We know these coup efforts in the aggregate or collectively as the Russian collusion hoax and the Ukrainian abuse of power fiction. We could also call them the progeny of Obamagate. It wasn't the Trump campaign or Trump or his administration that committed illegal Bill of Rights violating acts or that acted feloniously, but it was the opposition party that previously occupied the White House right up to the power transfer to Trump and even a bit beyond. Right, Susan Rice, former Obama National Security Advisor. In addition, none of these people upheld their oath to uphold the Constitution or kept their oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. The bad Obama era actors occupied the highest level of the federal bureaucracy and reached deeply into Obama's cabinet, including his attorneys general and ultimately, of course, the former president himself. After more than 3 long years, the witch hunt is over and Trump is still president. Can't have that. Then came the coronavirus, specifically the totally over-the-top policy response to it. From bureaucrat Fauci's unheralded CDC lockdown/quarantine guidelines, not to isolate and protect the vulnerable and elderly, which has been done throughout history to considerable effect, typically all the way back to biblical times, but to essentially shut down the entire country. Well, this policy has proven to be a political, financial, and economic disaster of unprecedented dimensions. States, counties, and municipalities eagerly adopted the CDC guidelines. In litigious America, also at least partly due to contingency fee lawsuit fears. In a perhaps even more significant sense, which is my suspicion because too many authorities with dictator tendencies jumped at the chance to abuse power, to sell safety to a fearful population, listening to and watching endless mainstream media propaganda and endless fear-mongering hype for months. This has been especially true in blue states, blue counties, blue municipalities, Democratic, where taxpayers are often treated like second-class citizens, especially if they actually think they have some freedoms and constitutional rights. Can't have that. Said differently, many power-hungry state and local authorities went beyond the CDC guidelines. How about arresting surfers? Or moms playing in deserted parks with their kids? Or families visiting relatives across town for flavor? These authorities have despotically held people and businesses suspended animation, despite growing evidence of much lower than generally projected or feared coronavirus death rates, especially in states whose business and venue shutdowns were less extreme and are ending or have ended. And by the way, as I've often said and also shown, the actual virus death rate or the suspected death rate was proven or thought to be much lower by significant immunologists 3 months ago that said there's no way this is going to be a terrific pandemic. And even Fauci chimed in on it. But never mind, everyone acted, I think, largely for coup reasons, as if this was going to be the second coming of the Spanish flu. Well, speaking of states whose businesses and ventures were shut down, but in a less extreme and less lasting manner, let me give you a case in point of such a state, namely Florida, related to virus-triggered deaths. That state, or my state, with some 21.3 million residents, reported, as of yesterday, 2,566 deaths attributed to the coronavirus, which amounts to an overall population death rate of 0.012%. Yet even in red state Florida, the governor forced lots of businesses to close, especially and venues, especially smaller businesses, including your dentists, for some 2 months. My dentist has always been super careful with his older clientele and has a terrific safety track record. Proof is in the pudding. And yet he, like many like him, were shut down despite their appeals, creating tremendous hardship of both the financial and the personal kind, creating dislocation, terminations, and likely bankruptcies for such a small overall death rate. I have often remarked over the past few months that the cure was likely worse than the disease, and this has been borne out. My point, what happened to cost-benefit analysis, to honest reporting, to sanity, to sustainable economics? Is bludgeoning the already harassed and increasingly endangered small business sector also part and parcel of the status quo that continues to go beyond trying to dislodge Trump from the White House? I think so. Don't you? I don't know how else one can explain it. By the way, as you would expect in an increasingly fascistic system, big business was considered essential by those controlling the instrumentalities of government power. Thus, big businesses such as Walmart or Costco could remain open, albeit with restrictions, while their Main Street competition died of revenue asphyxiation of shutdowns. Big business also got lots of K Street/Wall Street bailout money, also as expected. Main Street enterprises, meanwhile, well, I'll get into that. In any event, and as a result of the wet blanket policy response, Unparalleled overall damage has been done, including to civil liberties. Civil liberties, the kind protected in the Bill of Rights, such as the freedom to assemble peacefully, privacy rights, and private sector property rights, have been trashed like never before. In my view, this constitutes an integral part of an ongoing coup against the political, financial, and economic blueprint of the United States, namely its hallowed and absolutely unrivaled Constitution seeking to protect individual liberty. This Constitution was also set up to keep money honest, thus shutting down funding for redistributionism, statism, and its uglier cousin, our widespread kleptocracy. It was also set up to ring-fence government while maxing individual freedoms, due process rights, and very significant, as I stated, property right protections, or to maximize property rights. The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which are broadly aped at the state level as the initial states gave birth to America's governing blueprint in the first place, this blueprint counted on its citizens bringing to the table personal responsibility and civil behavior, the other enabling side of the freedom coin. Call it the ultimate manifestation of the Enlightenment age principles, many of which stem back to Greek and Roman / Cicero principles of philosophy and their manifestation, namely classically liberal, not today's liberal definition, but classically liberal political underpinnings. That's the framework that resulted from this philosophy. You can't have fidelity to individual empowerment and personal responsibility if you are a statist or a fascist or a kleptocrat. In fact, you have to overthrow them. Back to that coup again. Stepping back for a moment, the multi-decade, multi-pronged coup effort to totally eviscerate the founding principles of America as detailed in the Declaration of Independence and implemented in the Constitution accelerated greatly under the Obama administration. President Obama actively sought out a fundamental transformation of America. In fact, he stated this numerous times as an overarching goal of his administration. I suspect that this also had him encourage illegal voting in the 2016 election on his way out, after which Hillary and the Democratic establishment were supposed to expand and finish Obama's de facto Marxist transformation, which by definition, Marxism, cannot coexist with individual freedom. Collectivism never can. Ironically, the tremendous destruction of individual freedom and private property right protections was disastrously kicked off by a progressive / statist Republican president by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, especially between 1905 and 1909. As such, in reality, there has been a 111-year coup against fidelity to the Constitution, greatly enabled by the creation of the Fed in 1913. The coronavirus response has been used to kick this 100-year-old effort into overdrive, I'll argue, like never before. The same response has also hugely impacted the healthcare sector, the virus response, where many healthcare workers, including at the most prestigious facilities in America, have been fired or furloughed. Why? Because healthcare providers had to either materially downsize or eliminate elective or so-called non-essential procedures and examinations. That determination of non-essential is obviously made by bureaucrats, and I'm not going to say that they're clueless, or am I? but they're certainly motivated politically. In any event, business volume plummeted and no longer covered costs. This sector, too, is shriveling. Plus, many people became fearful of even seeking health care, visiting a hospital or a health care institution, afraid that they too would be exposed to the second coming of the Spanish flu. Combined, a veritable health crisis has been triggered, which may well boomerang into unsurpassed proportions that will ultimately rival and greatly surpass the damage and death sadly inflicted by the coronavirus. Call it the downside of centralized decision-making imposed unconstitutionally upon huge swaths of U.S. industry and the U.S. population. Or call it a statist calculation to drive the remaining truly private portion of the healthcare sector into insolvency and thus fully into government hands. Obamacare Plus, yet another anti-free market capitalist coup? Moreover, the U.S. economy, like most economies, is on the ropes. While this isn't news, a recent survey pointed to what I have maintained for months, namely that Main Street businesses are going to get absolutely eviscerated because no small business can survive months of zero revenue generation juxtaposed against sustained fixed costs, no matter how sound that business's balance sheet was going in. This fact, I call it the Dove factor, is finally belatedly hitting home among both Wall Street and even with some alt media pundits long too focused on understating the unprecedented strangulation of civil liberties and Main Street makers' rights to be open for business. Collectively, the U.S. coronavirus response also aped in much of the West, which, well, I'm going to put it this way. The virus policy response isn't the straw that broke an ailing, misallocated, faltering productivity growth, lacking price discovery, highly indebted U.S. and global economies back. Rather, it's the bridge that fell on that camel's back. In fact, small businesses, in my opinion, ought to join forces in class action lawsuits, legitimate ones this time around, against the very states and local governments that forced them into insolvency. That is, prohibited them from opening or reaching the business volume necessary to sustain their businesses that would have otherwise been possible, absent the virus response. What has happened is a clear violation of the Takings Clause property right protection segment of the Fifth Amendment. And to recall that the 14th Amendment grants all 50 state residents federal Bill of Rights protections. Once again, rights that the founding states insisted on adding to the U.S. Constitution as an additional firewall against a tyrannical federal government. In fact, only with that promise that these what came to be known as the Bill of Rights amendments added, did the states that got together and approved the Constitution give their approval in the first place, or the representatives of those states. Rights and protections, in other words, that state governments already widely granted their own state citizens or residents, they also wanted to be granted at the federal level. It came from the states, not from the federal government. Let me now get back to the Dove factor for a moment and give you some U.S. small business in jeopardy flavor. The source is a recent Newsweek survey titled, "Even with Loans, Survey Shows Almost Half of Small Business Owners Say They'll Have to Shut Down for Good." Some details from that survey, from that Newsweek article. Of those surveyed, 47% they anticipate shutting down, and 41% said they are looking for full-time work elsewhere. Respondents also shared their experiences with a Paycheck Protection Program, known as PPP, a federal loan initiative meant to alleviate fiscal burdens to small business during the breakout. I call it thanks to the virus response. Less than half of the participants, 38%, involved in Aslow's recent survey, the company that I guess Newsweek hired or took on board in terms of the survey. Only 38% of that recent survey of small businesses applied for PPP loans. Of those who did apply, 37% said the program was too slow to distribute funds, and 20% described the process as painful. Additional studies examining the loan program's effectiveness for small business have produced similar results. One, conducted by analysts from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, indicated that fewer small businesses had successfully obtained PPP loans in regions experiencing more severe ramifications of the pandemic than others. In other words, where it's needed most. So I ask you, how is an economy supposed to come back to strength or vigor if 47% of its small businesses, which collectively employ 58.9 million people, or 47.5% of the country's total employee workforce, expect to close down on the heels of the coronavirus policy response, an absolutely unparalleled shutdown/quarantine? And with the coronavirus news capture finally fading amidst this endless drumbeat for months, and more importantly, amidst declining new infections and reduced growth in coronavirus-attributed deaths, what will be the leftist/fascist kleptocrats led by George Soros and his putrid ilk? What will be their next coup effort to drive the economy into the basement while stirring the very anarchy needed to finally trigger a fundamental transformation of the U.S. political and economic system, a project that, as I mentioned, has been underway, waxing and waning, it's currently waxing, for over a century? Well, how about capitalizing on the national shock and justified outrage over the horrifically brutal murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer to finance, equip, and stoke mass protests across the country that often end up vandalizing and robbing the very stores in lower income communities that have been sabotaged by the coronavirus shutdown and quarantine? How about providing piles of bricks at strategic locations across the country's citizens for protesters? No, for rioters. Rioters that have been bussed in from afar with which to ignite mayhem, looting, and killing of innocent citizens and business people. Where are the cameras when you really need them? Not just for barbershops opening back up or for surfers. And what about all the social distancing and house arrest diktats, fines, and incarceration threats and even realities for those out and about in massive crowds? I guess it depends upon what you're doing. Again, as long as it's not surfing or going to the beach or opening up a barber shop, bricks and Molotov cocktails are a different matter entirely, apparently. Have Democratic leaders spoken out about the violence and destruction that angry mobs are inflicting upon law-abiding citizens and small business people that can collectively, these rioters, do much more harm than any virus ever could, especially if anarchy results? Not on your life. They've been as silent as church mice, our Democratic leaders. In fact, the coronavirus lockdown leaders are joining mass protests. If this doesn't highlight their utter hypocrisy, then it should showcase the real coup that is going on against individual liberty, citizen safety, private property right protections, and the rule of law, don't you think? It's as if leftist politicians sought to fan strife and violence while creating differences between people where there aren't any. By the way, numerous studies have shown, and common sense would dictate, that most residents of minority communities, and for that matter of any community, are very grateful for an active and engaged local police presence, for that's when they feel safest and most free to pursue their daily lives and tend to their business. Moreover, I personally firmly believe that 99% of the people don't care. They don't give a rip what the color of your skin is or what you believe in. People just want to conduct commerce, earn money, feed their families, and salt away something. I see it myself, often daily. Is the organized nationwide rioting unleashed after the tragic murder of George Floyd a further coup against the rule of law, against property right protections, and thus against a functioning society? Not just another coup effort to drive Trump from the White House in 2020, even though this continues to be a clear motive. I think you can check off both those boxes. Moreover, what does this mean in terms of this rioting generating even more profound economic weakness, less income generation, and less money in the pockets of more people? Speaking of money and more, consider, if you would, the national financial and economic situation, referring to the United States, which I find to be extreme. The Fed is creating unlimited money, liquidity, and financing bailouts. We've all heard about it. The federal government, meanwhile, is embarking on unlimited deficit spending and bailouts financed by the Fed. Annual growth in M1 and M2 amidst a collapsing economy jumped to historic highs in April 2020, while money supply expansion accelerated into early May. A ratio of a collapsing GDP juxtaposed against an exploding federal deficit and debt is an affirmation that the U.S. economy is incapable of covering U.S. government obligations. Last but not least, GDP inventory changes imply developing shortages, while infinite money creation is chasing too few goods. Think rapidly rising meat prices as a case in point, and services, think airplane tickets getting prohibitively expensive. All this money creation amidst shortages is setting the stage, shortages for vital things, not unnecessary things, is setting the stage for rapidly surging consumer basket inflation. I keep mentioning this. In a nutshell, are we so dysfunctional politically, mentally, and economically that the S&P 500 is trading for a stunning 22 times trailing 12-month GAAP earnings per share right before a 45 to 50% year-over-year Q2 GDP implosion that promises to drive EPS down much lower still, while our much higher debt, cheap money misallocations, and small business closures threaten to materially compress national income and corporate earnings per share for a protracted period of time. Does anyone see a stark valuation disconnect to coming EPS reality? Compression reality, massive compression reality. Especially if roughly half the businesses, once again, which employed roughly half the Americans, are likely to go out of business. How can an economy that got pasted by a virus policy response get back on its feet, much less its knees, if half of its small business backbone may shutter for good? Or are the profound stock and bond asset bubbles created by our and other statist central banks the worst manifestation of perhaps the most profound and pernicious coup of all, namely one against real yields for savers, no wonder there are no savings, against sound finance, against sound allocations, against productivity-enabled deflation, and against purchasing power protection. That's quite a coup. That is a central planning coup against a viable economic system for the greatest number of people. For if society lacks economic and financial health, it's only a matter of time before it will also lack freedom and the rule of law. All those things are tied at the hip. And when I mention the rule of law, I'm talking about a just rule of law. Well, those are my thoughts on June 4th from Bonita Springs, Florida, on this rainy, cloudy day. It's been raining cats and dogs in Southwest Florida. As I am close to being out the door for a family reunion I greatly look forward to on the other side of the big pond. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you got something out of this.